Dr. Anthony Dillon, thank you very much for agreeing to be part of the interview and the series.
My pleasure.
You've been a vocal critic recently of the Black Lives Matters movement and also of the marches, which is focused on, in Australia, the deaths in custody. I was wondering if you could tell me why that is.
Okay. I've been a critic of them recently, yes, but also been a critic for a much longer time of the bigger picture, the broader context, and that is the promotion of the myth that Aboriginal people are endlessly victims of white Australia. So what we're seeing recently is the BLM, Black Lives Matter, have capitalised on what they thought was an injustice, Aboriginal deaths in custody. And there's a couple of things wrong with that. First of all, they only seem to be interested in black lives if there's a white perpetrator. And they believe that for Aboriginal deaths in custody, that these are people who have died at the hands of white people. And while that might be true for a minority, the vast majority it's not. And also, as people are starting to slowly realise now, thank goodness, that Aboriginal people in custody do not die at higher rates than non-Aboriginal people in custody. So that's why I've been a critic, because it's a myth and it's a poisonous myth.
I read in your work that since the Royal Commission into deaths in custody in 1991, Aboriginal deaths in custody, that 432 Aboriginal people have died in custody. But you compare that to the 1,600 non-Indigenous people who have died in custody in the same time. And if you standardise it and you report stats from the Australian Institute of Criminology saying that, in fact, Indigenous people are now less likely than non-Indigenous people to die in custody.
Yes, and that's not my stats too. It's not research I've done. It's just Google, just look at the reports. And that's been known since day one of the Royal Commission.
So, I mean, there's a reasonable amount of complexity around this, though, isn't there? I mean, it's not so much the death rate, it's the balance of the death rate with the incarceration rate. So even though Aboriginal people only comprise about 3% of the population, now up to 28% of Aboriginal people are incarcerated, adult males.
Yes, and that's a different issue. It's related, but it is a different issue from deaths in custody, yes. The higher incarceration rate is something that nobody denies and nobody thinks a good thing. So we can all agree that we need to bring those incarceration rates down. How we bring them down, there could be disagreement there.
So this is where the contention comes in. You quote a stat which talks about 2016 to 2017, the death rate for Indigenous prisoners was 0.14% out of 100 compared to 0.19% for non-Indigenous prisoners. So using the same stats or stats from the Australian Institute of Criminology, The Guardian, I think, calculated a crude rate per 100,000 to show that Indigenous people are actually 10 times more likely to die in prison than non-Indigenous people.
Yes, but can it be taken in drawing that conclusion? So if I can just give you a couple of examples. First of all, the thinking they've used there, if I was to apply similar thinking, I would say, there's a terrible injustice. Men in jail, 90% of prisoners in jail that die are men, and yet they only make up 50% of the population. Well, that's true, but you need to consider that within the prison population, they also make up about 95% of the prisoners. Yes. So you really can't compare that figure to, the 50% in the population. As another example, if there was a town somewhere in Australia where 90% of its population were Aboriginal, you would expect about 90% of the deaths in that town to be Aboriginal. It would make no sense to compare the death rates or the number of deaths to the 3% figure, which is the Australian-wide population. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I think in terms of what people often forget is standardisation to populations. But I suppose the argument then would be the focus. So your focus is slightly different. Your focus is not about the deaths in custody themselves. I take it from reading your work, and you're not denying that people die under conditions sometimes because of correctional control and violence. But your issue is that the focus should be rather on the actual incarceration rate itself and what we do about that.
Yeah, the focus should be on presenting the truth, and that is Aboriginal people in custody are not more likely to die than non-Aboriginal people in custody. And given that there are high incarceration rates, which nobody would dispute, how do we go about reducing the incarceration rates? And just on that matter too, some people think, oh, well, the best way to prevent deaths in custody is to reduce the incarceration rates. No, all that does is just change the location of where people die. As pointed out, as far as death rates and that go, Aboriginal people are doing well, or at least better or equal to non-Aboriginal people in jail. But yes, we'd prefer not to have anyone in jail, but given that Aboriginal people are so overrepresented, we want them back in the community, working, being fathers, being husbands, being role models, that sort of thing, contributing to society.
Well, do we have a clear breakdown for Indigenous people in prison, the percentage of people who die due to things like medical issues versus people who die because of some incident that involves correctional staff?
Those sorts of figures you can grab straight off the Australian Institute of Criminology